Have you seen anything within the past, I don't know, 4 to 5 months, especially with regards to COVID-19 and the situation that the world is in now, that have added new or specific challenges with regards to resiliency?
Absolutely. So, the interesting thing with COVID-19 is, the last time we went through a global pandemic was the 1910s, around 1918. And so globally, no one has been through this.
Good evening, Sasebo. Good evening, Navy Region Japan. This is Chaplain Lawrence with another episode of Taps with Chaps. This is our 6th episode, and I'm very pleased to welcome today our special guest, Lieutenant Commander Carson, who's the Command Chaplain here at Commander Fleet Activity Sasebo. Welcome, Chaplain Carson. And as I do with all my guests, just start by telling us a little bit about yourself. What's your background, maybe some of the duty stations that you've been to?
Sure. So I am Chaplain Carson, been in the Navy for about 10 years. Started at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina with the Marines. Did that for about 2.5 years, and then moved to Newport, Rhode Island, where I was the Deputy Command Chaplain up there at the base chapel. And then most recently I've been on the Germantown here in Sasebo, going in my 4th year right now, moved over to the base about a year ago. So that's more or less about what I've done. Prior to that, I was in civilian ministry for about 13 years. Okay. Yeah.
That's perfect. And so you bring a unique perspective of having served on the waterfront and now serving on the shore. So you moved from the supported entity now to the supporting entity. And so that probably gives you a broader perspective of your role in being a chaplain. And
yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I noticed as I was here, coming from the ship side, you're looking for very specific things from the shore entity. Just the way the operational tempo, as we hang out in Sasebo and we see, every spring and every summer and every fall, the ships go out and they come back. And so the people on those ships are looking for very specific things from the shore side. And so what better individuals to kind of meet that need than those who have kind of lived within that op tempo, that wax and waning. So it was good to come to this side and bring some of that institutional knowledge from the waterfront to the shore side and say, okay, how do we meet those needs? So, yeah.
So our discussion, which we're going to continue through this series, is kind of focused around resiliency. And so within your field of chaplaincy and your work, how would you define resiliency? What does that look like to you?
So when we look at that word resiliency, there's a bunch of different answers, but I think illustrations are one of the best ways to look at complex terms like resiliency. One of the ones that has stuck with me very early on in my career, someone referred resiliency as shock absorbers. So if you think about a young sailor, young Marine just getting into the service, their shock absorbers maybe aren't that big. They're kind of a low rider. So everything kind of bottoms them out. But then when you've seen, you've deployed, you've seen some stuff, you've gone through some things in your life, that shock absorber starts to grow a little bit. And so then you have the more, I would argue, chaplains, your senior enlisted, your chiefs, some of your senior officers have larger shock absorbers. And so they kind of can deal with a little bit more. And over the course of your life, you build your shock absorbers when you deal with that stress in an appropriate way.
Perfect. And what are some of those things that test the shock absorbers that kind of impact resiliency, or maybe some of the things that you see in here as a chaplain that are resiliency issues, challenges to resiliency?
So I think, most of us, when we're coming into the service, we have a very, I would say almost a concrete definition of what we think the world is supposed to look like. And then we come face to face with cultures or with institutions or with dynamics that completely upend that. The first time that you're deployed, the first time that you're in combat, all of a sudden the natural order of things, the way life is supposed to go, it doesn't go that way. We're kind of for the most part, we kind of daydream what the future is supposed to look like, and when it doesn't turn out that way, all of a sudden we bottom out, or all of a sudden we stress. And so now we have to come face to face with, okay, how do I adapt my worldview, the way that I view the world, how do I deal with that in light of this new information that's been brought on board? And so that's really where the crux is. We have to meet them at that point. How do we deal with that crisis?
And I imagine, the crisis for individuals individuals is going to be different from person to person to person. Maybe how one person experiences a culture, a situation, an institution is going to be radically different from another person based on their backgrounds and what they're bringing to it. And so how do we adjust fire or meet the needs of individuals based on those different angles of approach that they're coming at the issue with?
I think you kind of hit on something right there that I think is a really important point, is that everyone experience is different. And sometimes those of us in the business of care, maybe it worked for the last person, and sometimes maybe we want to talk over the issue, talk over the person, and get to the solution real quick. But not every solution is right for every problem. And in fact, the issue may look exactly the same. Maybe it's a bad breakup, or you've been through a long deployment, and we look at it and we say, oh, well, this solution worked the last time, so it'll work this time. But that dynamic of what they bring to the table. And so I think the first thing we need to do is listen. And the reason that's so important, I use this a lot in some of my briefs, is we have this idea, we think through problems in pictures. I would argue that everybody's got a YouTube video playing in the back of their mind. And if it's a good thing, then we trump it up. And if it's a bad thing, we make it significantly worse. But talking about it, having this dialogue with somebody, gives us the ability to work through it, to problem solve it. So one of the most critical things, I think, in dealing with an issue is being able to get it off your chest, to talk through that. And so as those of us in the business of care, I think one of the most critical skills that we have is not bringing something new to the table, but just simply listening.
And I think that's a really important point, not just for caregivers too, but anybody who's in a leadership position. If you're an LPO, if you're a chief, if you're a DIVO, whatever your role is, just listening to your sailors, if they're telling you life's troubles or woes, is just big step number one in kind of meeting mission with resiliency. If they feel listened to, you can get a lot done.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's leadership skill set number one, is listen. Not to say, well, this is the way you should solve it because this is the way I did. And we tend to do that because we know it worked, and so we want to provide something that will work. But sometimes just hearing somebody and validating that, hey, these feelings are real, I understand you're dealing with this, maybe try this, to add those, but to also put give them the power, let them make those decisions, because that's huge. Because when I take ownership of my problems and I can work through those and I have success in that, number one, I'm more likely to say, hey, I can do it the next time. And number two, because you as a leader have instilled that power and that authority within me, I'm more likely to believe in you as my leadership and say, hey, this is the person who helped me. And those are huge key points, yeah.
Have you seen anything within the past, 4 to 5 months, especially with regards to COVID-19 and the situation that the world is in now, that have added new or specific challenges with regards to resiliency?
Absolutely. So, the interesting thing with COVID-19 is, the last time we went through a global pandemic was the 1910s, around 1918. And so globally, no one has been through this. And so we are experiencing, we've been through stresses, and other people have been through, really horrific stuff and come out the other side, better, having walked through those spaces. But the issue is sometimes as leaders, we don't have the answers. And so I think there's something to be said for uniting together, that, hey, we're all going through this together. The idea of building that bond, whether it's as a crew, as a command, as a community. But yeah, absolutely, the stress is unique to to this year. We say hindsight's 2020, and maybe that's going to be a statement going forward that's going to be absolutely true because of everything we've experienced. But when you start to see the silver lining in it, we start to see the resiliency. We start to see people coming out of the woodworks and new ideas and fresh ways of approaching problems. That's a good thing. We just have to remind each other, hey, success is on the horizon. We just need to do this as, kind of one team, one fight.
I imagine every sailor, Marine service member will have, a story to tell to the next generation of when they went through COVID-19 and what that was all about, and that'll be kind of a generational story of
Absolutely,
event.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that we do in addition to listening, which you mentioned, to build resiliency back up? Once it's been depleted or tested, how do we build somebody back up in a situation?
I I think one of the things when we look at resiliency, kind of the flip side of that is stress. What are the stressors? And one of the illustrations that I use a lot when talking about stress is talking about using it in the understanding of physical stress. So if physically, when I am stressed, if I go to the gym and I work out, I've got to stress my body physically to get stronger. And so understanding that also works intellectually, mentally, spiritually, all of those, to understand that stress that you're going through can build you up, but we have to do that the appropriate way. And so one of those things is, number one, there's a couple of different modalities, and caregivers would understand some of these, such as, acceptance, commitment therapy, to accept that this is where we are, commit to change, and then start to move forward. And one of the ways we do that as caregivers, I think, is to say, hey, you don't have to remain stuck here. And to give them options and then say, okay, what would you do about it? One of the best tools that I like to use in my toolbox is to say, when I'm talking to an individual and I ask them their age, they tell me, well, I'm 23. And so I say, okay, let's imagine that 33-year-old you came. I got up, walked out, 33-year-old you came and sat down. What would they say to you? And what that does is that puts the onus on them. Okay, successful 33-year-old me, what would I say? How would I inspire myself? Because what you get out of that is they start to say, hey, maybe I can stop this. And it's amazing some of those answers that they come up with. It may not be the answer that I would give them, but again, they take ownership of where they are, and then they start to move forward. And it goes right back on them. You're there to support, you're there to put your arm around them, walk beside them, but you give them the power to make the decision to take that next step. And that's huge.
Yeah. What are some of maybe the resources that we have available on base or on ships, or places and people that they can go to, sailors, whether they're sailors or family members, if they're having a difficult situation that's testing their resiliency?
Yeah, what an incredible time really to be in the Navy when it comes to resources, and I know some of your previous guests have probably mentioned, you've got MFLACs, you've got behavioral health, the clinic, you've got Fleet and Family, you've got chaplains, you've got all these other resources, but some of the other resources, one of the things that I tell sailors a lot is I say, always have a chaplain, know a chaplain. They don't have to wear the uniform, they don't have to have the religious device, but what I mean by chaplain is somebody who's just going to sit and listen. It could just be a best friend, it could be calling back home, talking to mom and dad. Even though we're kind of disconnected and we're in our bubbles with COVID, FaceTime's right there. What an amazing time for technology. So it's really having those people who know that they have your back, not to mention all the other plethora of resources from Military One Source, Chaplain Care Line, and the list is kind of exhaustible. But always knowing that you have somebody ready to listen, that we should always have, okay, if I've got to make one call, who's that call? And just kind of have that in your, that's your speed dial. That's your 911 call. Who do I call when things go rough?
Yeah, that's perfect. Is there anything else you want to share with us about resiliency, or on the topic of how chaplains integrate with resiliency?
No, I think the big thing is, one of the things to recognize as we're going through this is there's nobody with all the answers. And while you may come see to a chaplain, or you may go to a mental care provider, or anyone else, a senior enlisted, a chief or an officer, your CO, to understand that each of those individuals, they haven't arrived. They're just a little bit further down that journey than you are. And to recognize that we're all in this together, that we're all marching through life together. And what that does for me is I can look to that person ahead of me and say, you know what, they made it that far. What are some tips that they can give me so that I can take that next step? And then at the same time, to look behind me and see who's still coming up. So it's almost, united. We link hands with the person in front, link hands with the person behind, and we get there together. I think that's the biggest thing, to just know that you are not in this alone.
That's great. Well, thank you, Chaplain Carson, for sharing your wisdom, your experience, your insights, your perspective as a chaplain.
Yeah, definitely.
And thank you to all of you in 7th Fleet AOR, service members and families, for your continued resilience during COVID-19 and in all that are facing us in terms of challenges. This is Chaplain Lawrence signing off. We'll see you next week. Take care.